The glass shattered against the marble floor as Richard Halston's hand slipped, the sound echoing through the massive bedroom like a gunshot. He stared at the broken glass, red wine bleeding slowly across the white tiles, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run for his life. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glowed, alive, loud, unstoppable, but inside the room, everything felt deathly still. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. For the first time in 30 years, the billionaire was shaking. Not because of the markets, not because of competition, not because of money, but because of something far more terrifying: doubt. He had just returned from the hospital, the faint smell of antiseptic still clinging to his expensive coat. The doctor's words replayed in his mind, not as a diagnosis but as an opening, a doorway to a truth he had been avoiding his entire life. "You need rest," the doctor had said gently. "And support." Support. The word felt foreign. Richard laughed bitterly under his breath and looked around the bedroom. Italian furniture, custom artwork, a bed worth more than most people's houses. Everything screamed success. And yet, there was no one sitting beside him. No one asking if he was okay. No one waiting. Downstairs, the sound of laughter floated up the marble staircase. His family was home. Richard stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the sound. The living room was glowing with warm lights and louder voices. Margaret, his wife of 26 years, was sprawled comfortably on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, her jewelry catching the light with every flick of her wrist. Evan, the older son, lounged in an armchair, a drink in hand. Lucas, the younger one, leaned against the wall, laughing at something on his phone. They didn't notice Richard at first. "I'm telling you," Evan said, grinning, "once the merger goes through, Dad's net worth will jump again. We should celebrate early." Margaret smiled without looking up. "As long as the money keeps flowing, I don't care how many mergers there are." Lucas chuckled. "Imagine being broke. Couldn't be us." They laughed. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. He cleared his throat. The room went quiet. Margaret looked up first. "Oh, you're back early. No, how was the hospital? No, are you okay? Everything all right?" Evan asked casually, swirling his drink. Richard nodded slowly. "Yes. I just wanted to sit with you all." Lucas glanced at the clock. "Now?" Richard hesitated, then sat down. "I've been thinking lately. About family." Margaret sighed softly, already annoyed. "Richard, can this wait? I had a long day." He studied her face, the same face he had once fallen in love with. Perfect makeup. Perfect hair. No warmth. "Do you think," Richard asked carefully, "that people would still love me if I didn't have money?" The question hung in the air. Lucas laughed first. "What kind of question is that?" Evan smirked. "Dad, why would you even think like that?" Margaret finally put her phone down. "Richard, don't be dramatic. You have money. That's not going to change." "But if it did," he pressed. "If everything was gone?" Margaret's eyes hardened. "That's a pointless question." There it was. Pointless. Richard nodded slowly, stood up, and walked away without another word. No one followed him. No one stopped him. Later that night, long after the lights in the mansion dimmed, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at old photographs scattered across his desk. One showed him as a young man, standing in front of a tiny office with peeling paint, smiling like he had just conquered the world. Another showed Margaret in their early years, her smile genuine, her arms wrapped around him. The last photo showed Evan and Lucas as children, sitting on his shoulders, laughing. "When did it change?" he whispered. His phone buzzed. A message from Evan. "Hey Dad, quick question. If anything ever happened to you, the company shares would be split evenly, right? Just planning for the future." Richard closed his eyes. That night, sleep refused to come. The next morning, Richard arrived at his company headquarters earlier than usual. The building stood tall and proud, bearing his name in steel letters. Employees greeted him with respect, some with admiration, some with fear. This was the world that obeyed him. The world that never questioned his value. Inside the executive elevator, his lawyer, Daniel Brooks, joined him. "You look tired," Daniel said. "I'm thinking," Richard replied. "That's usually dangerous." Richard smiled faintly. "Daniel, if I told you I wanted to disappear for a while, what would you say?" Daniel studied him carefully. "I'd ask why." Richard hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I need to know who truly cares about me." Daniel's expression softened. "That kind of truth is never painless." "I'm prepared for pain," Richard said. "I'm not prepared for lies." The elevator doors opened. By the end of the day, Richard had made his decision. A dangerous one. A heartbreaking one. He would pretend to be sick. Not for sympathy. Not for drama. But for clarity. If money was the glue holding his family together, then removing it would show him everything he needed to know. As he drove home that evening, the mansion no longer felt like a home. Felt like a stage. And Richard Halston was about to pull back the curtain. The announcement came 3 days later, during dinner, when the chandeliers were glowing softly and the table was filled with food prepared by staff who had worked in the house longer than anyone in the family had stayed emotionally present. Richard waited until everyone had settled, until forks clinked against plates and casual conversation filled the room. Then he put his fork down. "I have something to tell you," he said. Margaret glanced up with a faint frown. "Can it wait until after dinner?" "No," Richard replied. His voice was steady but his hands were not. "It can't." Evan leaned back in his chair. "What's going on, Dad?" Richard inhaled slowly. "I've been diagnosed with a serious illness." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret's eyes widened, but only for a moment. "Illness?" she repeated. "What kind of illness?" "The kind that requires treatment. Rest. Time." He paused. "And there's no guarantee." Lucas frowned. "No guarantee of what?" "Of recovery." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Evan was the first to speak. "Okay. But doctors can treat almost anything these days, right?" "They can try," Richard said. "But I'll be stepping away from work for a while." Margaret's fingers tightened around her napkin. "Stepping away, how long?" "I don't know." "And the company?" Evan asked quickly. "Who'll be running things?" Richard looked at his son. Really looked at him. "That's your first question?" Evan hesitated. "I'm just being practical." Lucas cleared his throat. "What about the finances?" Margaret set her napkin down. "Richard, are you saying we need to adjust?" "Yes," he replied. "I've frozen non-essential accounts. Cut allowances. We'll need to live more modestly." Margaret laughed, sharp and humorless. "You must be joking." "I'm not." Her face hardened. "I didn't marry into modesty." The room went quiet again. "I need support," Richard said softly. "I need my family." Margaret pushed her chair back slightly. "Well, I need stability." Evan stood. "Dad, let's not overreact. You'll recover. This is temporary." Richard nodded. "I hope you're right." But even as they said the words, he could feel them pulling away. The next few weeks confirmed his fears. Margaret stopped joining him in the mornings. When he coughed or winced, she rolled her eyes instead of asking if he was okay. She complained constantly about the lack of shopping trips, the absence of vacations, the embarrassment of scaling back. "This house feels like a prison now," she snapped one evening. Evan visited less and less. When he did, he spoke only about business, about investors, about future plans, about contingencies. Lucas barely visited at all. One afternoon, Richard overheard Margaret on the phone. "I didn't sign up for this," she said coldly. "If this continues, I'll have to think about myself." Richard stood in the hallway, leaning on the wall for support. Not because he was sick, but because the truth felt heavier than any illness. A month later, Margaret packed a suitcase. "I need space," she said, avoiding his eyes. "This negativity isn't good for me." "For better or worse?" Richard whispered. She paused, then replied flatly, "This is worse." She left without looking back. The house grew quieter, then emptier. Evan stopped answering calls. Lucas sent a message once, "Hope you're okay." Nothing more. Medical appointments came and went. Richard attended them alone. He learned to cook simple meals. Learned how quiet nights could be when there was no one to ask how his day went. One afternoon, while walking slowly through the estate garden, his vision blurred. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto the gravel path. "Sir." A voice cut through the haze. A young woman ran toward him, dropping her tools. She knelt beside him, panic in her eyes. "Can you hear me?" she asked. Richard nodded weakly. She helped him sit up, handed him water, and stayed until his breathing steadied. "My name is Clara," she said gently. "I help my father with the gardens." "Thank you," Richard murmured. The next day she returned. Then the next. She brought soup once. Sat with him while he ate. Talked about nothing and everything. Her dreams, her struggles, her belief that kindness mattered. "Why are you doing this?" Richard asked one day. She shrugged. "You looked lonely." The word hit him harder than anything else. Lonely. Months passed. Then one morning Richard called Daniel. "It's time," he said. The truth was coming out. and it would change everything. Daniel arrived at the mansion the following afternoon, his expression serious, his briefcase held tightly in one hand. The house felt different now, quieter, colder, stripped of the illusion of warmth it once pretended to have. Richard sat in the living room, thinner than before, dressed simply, no trace of the powerful man the world once knew. "You're sure about this?" Daniel asked as he sat across from him. Richard nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." Daniel hesitated. "Once this is revealed, there's no undoing it. Relationships may not survive." Richard let out a slow breath. "They already didn't." Daniel opened his briefcase. "Then we do it cleanly. One meeting. Everyone present." Richard nodded again. "Invite them under the pretense of a legal update." "They'll come," Daniel said quietly. "Money always brings people back." The words stung because they were true. That evening, Richard sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a bowl of soup Clara had left on the stove earlier that day. She had smiled before leaving, telling him to rest, reminding him he mattered. A stranger. Someone with nothing to gain. He wondered how someone who barely knew him could show more care than those who shared his name. The invitations went out the next morning. Within hours, replies came flooding in. Margaret responded first. When? Evan followed. "I'll clear my schedule." Lucas replied minutes later. "I'll be there." Richard closed his eyes. Of course they would. The day of the meeting arrived with clear skies and quiet tension. The long dining table was set again just like old times. The chairs were filled once more, but this time the warmth was gone. The smiles were forced. The air was thick with expectation. Margaret entered first, impeccably dressed, her expression sharp. Evan followed, confident, almost eager. Lucas lingered behind, curious but guarded. Richard entered last. He stood at the head of the table. Margaret frowned. "You look better?" "I am," Richard replied calmly. Evan leaned forward. Daniel said this was important. "Is there something we should know?" "Yes," Richard said. "There is." Daniel stepped forward, placing documents on the table. Margaret glanced at them. "Is this about the will?" "In a way," Richard said. Lucas crossed his arms. "Dad, what's going on?" Richard took a deep breath. "I was never dying." The words hit like thunder. Margaret's eyes widened. "What?" "The illness," Richard continued. "It was a test." Evan stood abruptly. "A test?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice steady but his eyes burning. "I wanted to see who would stay when the money stopped." Margaret's face flushed. "That's sick." "No," Richard replied quietly. "What was sick was being abandoned." Lucas shook his head. "You lied to us." "I observed you," Richard corrected. "And you showed me exactly who you are." Evan scoffed. "You manipulated us." "I removed incentives," Richard said, "and watched love disappear." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "How dare you judge us?" Richard's voice rose for the first time. "How dare you leave me when I needed you most?" Silence followed. Evan spoke again, his tone defensive. "We didn't leave. We just adjusted." "You vanished," Richard said. "No calls. No visits. No concern." Margaret's voice cracked, not with regret but anger. "You humiliated us." Richard shook his head slowly. "You humiliated yourselves." Daniel cleared his throat. "The reason you're all here is to discuss the redistribution of assets." Margaret's posture straightened immediately. "Redistribution?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "Mr. Halston has revised his will." Evan swallowed. "Revised how?" Richard looked at them, really looked at them, for the last time with expectation. "You will receive exactly what you gave me," he said. Lucas frowned. "What does that mean?" "Distance," Richard replied. "Indifference. Conditions." Margaret's voice trembled. "Richard, be reasonable." "I am," he said. "For the first time in my life." Evan stepped forward. "Dad, come on. We're family." Richard met his gaze. "Family doesn't disappear when things get hard." Lucas exhaled slowly. "So that's it?" "No," Richard said. "That's the truth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You're choosing strangers over us?" "I'm choosing loyalty over blood," Richard replied. Daniel gathered the documents. "This meeting is over." Margaret stood frozen. Evan looked furious. Lucas looked lost. They left one by one. The door closed behind them. And for the first time in months, Richard felt light. That evening, Clara returned as usual. She found Richard sitting by the window watching the sunset. "You look peaceful today," she said. "I am," Richard replied softly. She smiled. That's good. He watched her walk back toward the garden and realized something profound. Sometimes the people who save us don't share our last name. The days that followed were strangely calm. There were no angry phone calls. No dramatic confrontations at the gate. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles in after a storm has passed and taken everything loose with it. Richard woke up one morning and realized he was no longer bracing himself for disappointment. The constant tension in his chest, the one he had mistaken for ambition all his life, was gone. He started doing things differently. He woke early not to check markets but to walk the grounds slowly, feeling the morning air on his face. He ate simple breakfast. He sat on the back steps with a cup of coffee watching the gardeners work. Clara often joined him, talking about her father's health, her dreams of opening a small plant nursery one day, her belief that life had a way of rewarding kindness in unexpected forms. You don't talk much about your family, she said one morning carefully. Richard smiled faintly. That's because I finally stopped waiting for them to change. She nodded as if she understood more than he expected. Weeks later the first crack appeared. Evan showed up unannounced. The sound of tires on the driveway pulled Richard from his thoughts. Evan stepped out of his car, dressed sharply, jaw tight. He walked in without waiting to be invited. We need to talk, Evan said. Richard gestured toward a chair. Sit. Evan remained standing. You've gone too far. Have I? Richard asked calmly. You embarrassed us. Cut us off. Made us look like villains. Richard met his son's eyes. I didn't make you anything. I just stopped protecting you from consequences. Evan clenched his fists. You're punishing us. No, Richard replied. I stopped rewarding neglect. Evan's voice cracked. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my life? Richard sighed. I know exactly what neglect does to a life. Evan swallowed hard, then changed tactics. Let's fix this. We can start over. Can you? Richard asked. Or do you just miss the lifestyle? Evan didn't answer. That was answer enough. Later that week Margaret called. Her voice was softer than before, almost sweet. Richard, I've been thinking. That's new, he replied gently. She ignored the comment. We built a life together. You can't just throw that away. I didn't throw it away, Richard said. I watched it walk out the door. Margaret sighed dramatically. I was under stress. So was I, Richard replied. But I stayed. There was a pause. Are you really giving so much of your estate to outsiders? Yes. To that girl? Margaret snapped. Richard's tone hardened. Say her name with respect. Margaret scoffed. She's using you. Richard smiled. She didn't even know who I was. Margaret hung up without another word. Richard sat quietly for a long time after that call, not angry, not sad, just resolved. The next confrontation came from Lucas. Lucas arrived hesitantly, less confident than his brother, eyes darting around the house as if he expected something to jump out at him. I didn't mean for things to turn out this way, Lucas said quietly. Richard studied him. But they did. Lucas nodded. I was scared. So was I, Richard replied. I thought you were dying. And you disappeared, Richard said gently. Lucas looked down. I didn't know what to do. You could have stayed, Richard said. That's all I needed. Lucas's shoulders sagged. I'm sorry. It was the first genuine apology Richard had heard. I believe you, Richard said. But belief doesn't erase memory. Lucas nodded, tears forming. Is there any chance? Richard shook his head slowly. There is a future. But it won't be built on entitlement. Lucas left quietly. That night, Richard updated the final documents. Charities that supported medical care, education, and small business owners were added. Longtime employees who had stood by him received generous allocations. Clara's name appeared, not as a reward but as recognition. Daniel read through the papers carefully. You're at peace with this? Richard nodded. For the first time. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside, the mansion felt less like a monument to wealth and more like a place where honesty lived. On the final evening before everything was officially signed, Richard sat alone in the study once more. The same desk. The same photos. But this time he didn't feel regret. He felt clarity. He whispered into the quiet room, I finally see you. Not them. Himself. The signing took place on a quiet morning, the kind of morning that felt intentional, as if the world itself had decided to slow down and bear witness. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the study, casting long shadows across the floor. Richard sat at his desk, Daniel beside him, the documents neatly arranged in front of them. "Once this is done," Daniel said softly, "there's no going back." Richard picked up the pen. His hand was steady. "I'm not trying to go back," he replied. "I'm moving forward." He signed his name slowly, deliberately, each stroke of the pen carrying the weight of a lifetime of decisions. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for decades. "It's done," Daniel said. Richard nodded. "Thank you." As Daniel left, Richard remained seated, staring at nothing in particular. He expected to feel something dramatic, relief, triumph, sorrow, but what he felt instead was quiet acceptance. The kind that settles in when the truth has finally been acknowledged and there is nothing left to pretend. Later that afternoon, Clara came by as she usually did. She noticed the change immediately. "You look lighter," she said, setting down a small basket of fresh vegetables. "I am," Richard replied with a faint smile. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "My father told me who you are." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" She nodded. "One of the staff mentioned it. About your company. Your wealth." "I see," Richard said. "Does that change anything?" Clara shook her head without hesitation. "No." He studied her face, searching for any trace of calculation. There was none. "I wanted you to know," she continued, "that whatever you decide to do, I'm grateful you trusted me." Richard felt his throat tighten. "You gave me something far more valuable than trust," he said. "You reminded me what kindness looks like when it's not bought." She smiled, slightly embarrassed. "My mother used to say that people show you who they are when they think you have nothing to offer." Richard nodded. She was wise. Days turned into weeks. News of Richard's revised estate spread quietly, then loudly. Some praised him. Others criticized him. Headlines speculated. Opinions flew. Richard paid none of it any attention. For the first time in his life, public approval meant nothing. Margaret tried once more, showing up unexpectedly at the gate, her expression softer than it had been in years. "You've made your point," she said. "Isn't it time to forgive?" Richard looked at her for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation." She scoffed. "So that's it." "That's honesty," he replied. She left, anger flashing briefly before disappearing down the driveway for the last time. Evan sent a long message days later, apologies mixed with justifications, regret tangled with resentment. Richard read it once, then archived it without replying. Lucas sent a shorter message. "I understand now. I wish I had understood sooner." Richard stared at the words for a long time before replying. Understanding is the beginning, not the reward. Life settled into a new rhythm. Richard downsized the mansion, donating most of it to a foundation. He moved into a smaller home near the gardens. He spent time mentoring young entrepreneurs, not about money but about balance. About presence. About the cost of neglecting what truly matters. Clara's father recovered enough to open a small nursery with Richard's quiet support. Clara never asked for anything and Richard never offered publicly. What he gave privately. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard sat on a bench overlooking the garden. Clara joined him, handing him a cup of tea. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He considered the question carefully. "I regret confusing provision with love," he said. "I regret thinking money could replace presence. But the truth?" He smiled gently. "No. I don't regret learning." She nodded. "Some people never do." Richard watched the sky darken, the first stars appearing one by one. He thought about the man he had been, the relentless builder, the absent husband, the distracted father. He thought about the man he was now, still wealthy but no longer owned by it. He realized then that the test hadn't been for his family alone. It had been for him. To strip away illusions. To confront his fears. To accept painful truths. And to choose peace anyway. Years later, when people spoke of Richard Halston, they spoke of his success, his philanthropy, his unconventional decisions. But those who truly knew him spoke of something else entirely. They spoke of a man who had the courage to ask a terrifying question, and the strength to accept the answer. Because the day Richard Halston learned the truth about his family was not the day he lost them. It was the day he finally found himself. And sometimes, that is the greatest fortune of all.